In the grand theatre of human history, few names echo with the resonance of Napoleon Bonaparte. From obscurity on a rocky Mediterranean island to imperial grandeur, and finally to the desolate loneliness of exile, his life reads like an epic forged by ambition, genius, and tragedy. His meteoric rise redefined the meaning of power in the modern world, and his dramatic fall became a cautionary tale etched in the annals of empire. This is the story of a man who reshaped Europe with the force of will, who crushed kingdoms, crowned himself emperor, and bent entire nations to his ambition. A master of war, a reformer of law, a manipulator of destiny. Yet, it was the very force that elevated him, his insatiable drive, that also sowed the seeds of ruin. His triumphs on the battlefield dazzled the world, but in the end, they could not outmatch the weight of hubris and time. We'll trace the arc of his legend, from the dusty classrooms of Brienne to the marble halls of the Tuileries, from the snows of Austerlitz to the scorched earth of Moscow, from Elba's fleeting dream to the mud of Waterloo. We'll dissect his tactics, his mind, his politics, and the legacy that refuses to fade. By the end, you won't just know the story of Napoleon, you'll understand the man behind the myth. So join us as we journey through power and ruin, strategy and folly. This is not just history, it's an autopsy of greatness. This is Napoleon Bonaparte, the rise and fall of France's greatest general. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15th, 1769, in Ajaccio, a small town on the rugged island of Corsica, a land known more for vendettas and goat herders than world-changing emperors. Just months before his birth, Corsica had been absorbed into French control after centuries of Genoese rule and fierce resistance by Corsican patriots. His family, of minor nobility with Italian roots, lived in a Corsica that simmered with resentment toward its new rulers. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, quickly aligned himself with the French administration, securing privileges and education opportunities for his children, decisions Napoleon would later view with complex feelings. Raised by his stern and formidable mother, Letizia, Napoleon grew up torn between his Corsican identity and the French elite he would be forced to integrate with. He never lost his accent, and he never forgot the sting of being an outsider in the land he was supposed to call home. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France for schooling, where his Corsican accent and awkward manner made him a target for ridicule. Yet in the cold halls of Brienne-le-Château, he discovered refuge in books. He devoured history, philosophy, and military theory, developing early admiration for figures like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and even Charlemagne. Reserved and solitary, he was already calculating, already observing the world as a chessboard of opportunity. By 1785, he graduated from the École Militaire in Paris as a second lieutenant of artillery, not infantry, not cavalry, but artillery, the most scientific and mathematical branch of the army. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the aristocratic old guard was swept away. Napoleon's birth status, once a barrier, was suddenly irrelevant. As officers fled or were executed, he found himself ascending the ranks in a nation where meritocracy replaced monarchy. His first taste of true glory came at the Siege of Toulon in 1793, where a 24-year-old Napoleon masterminded a strategy to retake the port from British-backed royalists. His clever positioning of artillery choked off the enemy's escape and turned the tide of battle. This victory earned him the rank of Brigadier General, a meteoric rise by any standard. Even in these early battles, the signs of genius were clear: precision, innovation, and a ruthless sense of timing. But it wasn't just talent that lifted him, it was also timing. In a France ruled by chaos, Napoleon emerged as a man of order. He understood better than most that in times of instability, the bold do not wait, they act. The French Revolution had removed the old rules. Napoleon was ready to write new ones in his own image. When Napoleon was given command of the army of Italy in 1796, many saw it as a dead-end assignment. His soldiers were ragged, starving, unpaid, and facing the combined might of Austria and the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia. But within weeks, Napoleon would turn a starving force into a sword of lightning, cutting through Italy like a force of nature. It was here that his reputation as a military genius was forged, not just through victory, but through vision. At the Battle of Lodi, Napoleon led a daring assault across a narrow bridge under intense fire, a moment immortalized in legend, whether or not he truly led the charge himself. What mattered was that it worked. He would later say, "It was at Lodi that I first saw myself as a man of destiny." Victory followed victory. Arcola, Castiglione, Rivoli. The Austrians were stunned. Napoleon's army became an extension of his will, fast, unpredictable, and devastating. But Napoleon fought wars on more than just the battlefield. He plundered wealth, art, and antiquities from Italy, feeding the coffers of France and his own legend. He sent paintings to the Louvre, rewrote victory bulletins to lionize himself, and built a cult of personality, not just through action, but through narrative. He was more than a general. He was becoming a myth-maker. The campaign ended with the Treaty of Campo Formio, where Napoleon negotiated directly with Austria, bypassing the French government. It was a bold and telling move. He wasn't just winning battles, he was taking control of France's diplomacy. The victories in Italy didn't just expand French territory. They positioned Napoleon as the most important man in France, even if he didn't yet hold a political title. In 1798, Napoleon launched an ambitious expedition to Egypt, a blend of conquest, scientific exploration, and anti-British strategy. He sought to strike at Britain's access to India, while also creating a legacy of enlightenment in the sands of antiquity. He brought with him not only soldiers but artists, scientists, and engineers, over 150 of them, to study and document Egypt. It was a cultural invasion as much as a military one. At the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon used his famous divisional square tactic to annihilate the Mamluk cavalry. Outnumbered but organized, the French decimated one of the world's oldest warrior classes. The battle was over in hours. The victory was total and symbolic. In the desert, Napoleon presented himself as the inheritor of ancient empires. Yet, glory would soon turn to disaster. The Battle of the Nile was a catastrophe. Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet, stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt. Cut off from reinforcements, supplies, and communication, the once victorious general found himself in a deteriorating situation. Plague broke out, morale plummeted, and uprisings threatened to engulf the campaign. Still, Napoleon spun defeat into illusion, returning to France with only the good news. Back in France, the Directory, the post-revolution government, was weak, corrupt, and unpopular. The time was ripe. In November 1799, 18 Brumaire, Napoleon executed a swift and stunning coup d'etat, backed by loyal troops and savvy political allies. He dissolved the Directory and installed the consulate, naming himself First Consul. The Republic still lived, on paper, but the wheels of empire were already turning. It wasn't just a military victory, it was the takeover of a nation. Napoleon proved that war, charisma, and timing could create political reality. From this moment on, France was his. The revolution had devoured kings. Now it had birthed a new kind of ruler, one who would crown himself. On December 2nd, 1804, inside the magnificent Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. In that single gesture, seizing the crown from the Pope's hands, he declared that his power did not flow from God or tradition, but from himself. This was no restoration of monarchy. This was a new kind of empire, born from revolution, baptized in war, and ruled by ambition. He was Caesar and Charlemagne reborn, cloaked in Enlightenment ideals but driven by personal glory. But Napoleon's empire was not built on conquest alone. It was underpinned by reform. He reorganized the state, streamlined taxation, modernized infrastructure, and codified laws into what would become his most enduring legacy, the Napoleonic Code. He reshaped the French education system, created the Bank of France, and redefined the relationship between church and state. Order replaced chaos. Bureaucracy replaced mob rule. The French people traded freedom for efficiency, and they did so willingly. Then came Austerlitz, the Battle of the Three Emperors, fought in 1805. Facing both Austria and Russia, Napoleon deliberately lured the Allies into a trap by feigning weakness. At the perfect moment, his troops struck with mathematical precision. The victory was devastating. Over 36,000 enemy casualties to fewer than 9,000 French. It was his military masterpiece, taught in academies to this day. Austerlitz wasn't just a win, it was a work of strategic art. By 1807, Napoleon was the undisputed master of continental Europe. He dismantled the Holy Roman Empire, installed puppet rulers in Italy, Holland, Spain, and Germany, many of them family members. Through a mixture of military threat, reformist appeal, and raw charisma, he constructed a new European order, a Napoleonic system. But while France expanded, resistance simmered beneath the surface. What Napoleon could conquer, he could not always hold. For all its enlightenment, the Napoleonic Empire was built on contradiction. It granted religious freedom, yet heavily censored the press. It offered equality before the law, yet reinstated slavery in the colonies. It empowered citizens while demanding total loyalty to a single man. Napoleon's rule was modern and medieval, rational and autocratic, reformist and repressive, a paradox of progress wrapped in iron discipline, and beneath the surface of absolute power was a growing anxiety. Napoleon had no true successor. He sought to control every facet of governance himself, making enemies of allies and narrowing his circle of trust. Every victory demanded the next. Every campaign fed his legend and drained his empire. He was not building peace. He was building a machine that could only run on war. In 1808, Napoleon marched into Spain to enforce the continental system and install his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. But what seemed like a quick regime change turned into a brutal, grinding nightmare. The Spanish people rejected foreign rule and rose in fury. What followed was one of the first true guerrilla wars in modern history, the Peninsular War. Napoleon had won battles, but Spain was not a battlefield. It was a rebellion. The brutality was staggering. French reprisals were ruthless. Civilians were tortured, towns razed, resistance punished. But each massacre only strengthened the Spanish resolve. British forces under Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, landed to support the resistance, opening a second front. The war bled France's manpower, morale, and treasury. As Napoleon later said, it was the beginning of the end. At the core of Napoleon's economic war was the continental system, a massive embargo against British goods. He aimed to cripple Britain by cutting it off from European trade. On paper, it was airtight. In reality, it was impossible. Smuggling flourished. Allies resented the restrictions. France's own economy suffered. And Britain, with its navy and global colonies, simply found other markets. The emperor could defeat armies, but not capitalism. The embargo strained relationships with allies and vassal states. Even Russia, officially Napoleon's partner after the Treaty of Tilsit, grew increasingly frustrated. When Tsar Alexander I withdrew from the system, Napoleon decided on his most ambitious gamble yet. He would march east and force compliance through war. Thus began one of the greatest military catastrophes in world history. In 1812, Napoleon led the Grande Armée, over 600,000 men, into Russia. But the Russians avoided direct battle, retreating deeper into their homeland while destroying crops and infrastructure behind them. This scorched earth strategy left the French army stretched thin, starved, and exposed. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found it abandoned and aflame. There was no victory, only empty streets and smoke. Then came the retreat. Winter closed in. Disease, starvation, and constant Russian raids devastated the once mighty force. Less than 10% of the army returned. It was a disaster on a scale that shocked Europe. Napoleon's mystique, the aura of invincibility, was shattered. For the first time, the emperor looked vulnerable. The wolves were circling. The disaster in Russia sent shock waves across the continent. Former allies turned enemies. Austria, Prussia, Sweden, and Britain all formed a new coalition. Uprisings spread through German states and Italy. Even in France, morale plummeted. Napoleon, always swift to recover, raised a new army, but it was younger, less experienced, and lacked the veterans he had lost in Russia. He was still fighting, still winning battles like Dresden and Lutzen, but they were victories without momentum. Every campaign was a desperate gamble. The empire was a house of cards now, and the fall was coming fast. By 1813, Napoleon's enemies had learned. No longer isolated, they were united. At Leipzig, over 600,000 troops from Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden converged against Napoleon in the largest battle Europe had ever seen. For 4 days, he fought with desperation and brilliance, but he was outnumbered, outgunned, and, fatally, abandoned by his German allies mid-battle. The defeat was total. Napoleon was now on the defensive in his own empire. The fall of Leipzig sent shockwaves through Napoleon's world. One by one, his puppet states collapsed. The grand empire he had forged was melting away. French troops now fought on French soil. The unstoppable conqueror of Europe had become a man scrambling to protect his homeland. His aura of invincibility was gone. In April 1814, with Paris occupied and his marshals refusing to fight on, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. It was the end of an era. The man who had once crowned himself ruler of a continent now accepted exile to the tiny island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. But even in exile, his mind raced. He monitored France obsessively. He knew the Bourbon restoration was fragile, and most of all, he was not done. On Elba, Napoleon tried to stay busy. He reformed the island's agriculture, schools, and even its military. But this wasn't a retirement. It was a pause. When he heard that France was restless and King Louis XVIII unpopular, he made his move. In February 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba and landed in France with just 1,000 men. What happened next stunned the world. As Napoleon marched north, French soldiers sent to arrest him joined him instead. No shots fired, no battles. Town after town welcomed him. The eagle flies from steeple to steeple, people whispered, until it reaches the towers of Notre Dame. Within 3 weeks, Napoleon was back in Paris, emperor once again. The 100 Days had begun. The powers of Europe reacted with panic and fury. Once more, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia mobilized their armies, but they would not let him rise again. Napoleon prepared for war, but time was against him. He needed a swift, crushing victory, and he bet everything on one final battle. On June 18, 1815, near a small village in Belgium, Napoleon faced off against the Duke of Wellington and Prussian forces under Blucher. He had hoped to divide and conquer, as he had done so many times before. But the battlefield was muddy, his generals were hesitant, and time was not on his side. The French attacks were brutal but fragmented, and when the Prussians arrived late in the afternoon, Napoleon's fate was sealed. Napoleon committed his last reserves, the Imperial Guard, but even they were repelled. As they retreated, a cry swept through the army. "La Garde recule! The Guard is retreating!" Panic followed. Waterloo was more than a defeat. It was an annihilation of hope. Napoleon fled the field, and with it, his empire died. This time, there would be no return. Napoleon surrendered to the British and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. It was bleak, isolated, and closely guarded. There, surrounded by a small court of loyalists, he spent his final years dictating memoirs, reflecting on his career, and defending his legacy. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon died at age 51. Some say it was stomach cancer. Others whisper of poison. But one thing was certain: the man who had redrawn Europe, who crowned himself emperor, who shook the world with ideas and iron, was gone. And yet, his story had only just begun. One of Napoleon's most enduring legacies wasn't forged on the battlefield. It was written in law. The Napoleonic Code, drafted in 1804, became a cornerstone of modern civil law. It emphasized equality before the law, protection of property rights, and secular authority. This legal framework spread across Europe and influenced countries far beyond, from Latin America to the Middle East. Napoleon's empire may have collapsed, but his bureaucratic and legal legacy lived on. Beyond the code, Napoleon reformed education, central banking, infrastructure, and merit-based civil service. Many of these systems became the backbone of the modern state. In some ways, his greatest conquest wasn't land, it was the modernization of society. After his death, a cult of personality began to form. Writers, painters, and poets romanticized Napoleon as a tragic hero, a misunderstood genius, a Promethean figure who challenged the gods and paid the price. The real man, flawed, brilliant, brutal, was eclipsed by the myth. People across Europe kept locks of his hair, tiny busts, and fragments of relics. His tomb at Les Invalides, established in 1840, became a site of pilgrimage. He became an icon, stripped of nuance. For some, a symbol of glory and genius. For others, a dictator and tyrant. But in every version, he loomed larger than life. Few historical figures have been claimed by so many in such contradictory ways. Napoleon's career became a blueprint and a warning. He inspired leaders across time. Hitler studied his campaigns obsessively. Mussolini mimicked his style. Charles de Gaulle evoked his memory to rebuild French pride. Even in failure, Napoleon remained magnetic, a man who showed how charisma, vision, and sheer will could move nations, and how ambition, unrestrained, could doom them. He also changed how we write history. Military academies still teach his strategies. His image still haunts political theory. To study Napoleon is to study the mechanics of power itself, how it's won, how it's kept, and how it collapses. So who was Napoleon? The savior of the revolution, or its destroyer? A military genius, or a warmonger? A reformer, or a dictator? The truth is, he was all of these things. He's a mirror we hold up to our values, changing with every generation. In him, we see greatness and hubris, progress and cruelty, vision and vanity. Napoleon once said, "What is history but a fable agreed upon?" And in the end, perhaps he was right. He lost everything, yet became immortal. Few men shaped the world so profoundly. Fewer still are remembered with such intensity. Napoleon Bonaparte, emperor, exile, enigma, remains to this day France's greatest general and history's eternal puzzle. Napoleon Bonaparte's life is not just a tale of rise and fall. It is a mirror reflecting the best and worst of human ambition. He was born in obscurity, rose through revolution, conquered a continent, and fell in exile. And in doing so, he etched himself into the very fabric of world history. He reshaped Europe, toppled monarchies, inspired revolutions, and pioneered reforms that still govern our lives. He was brilliant, flawed, ruthless, and visionary. A man who, in trying to master destiny, became its greatest lesson. To study Napoleon is to study ourselves, our thirst for greatness, our hunger for control, our brilliance, our blind spots. His story warns us, inspires us, haunts us. But most of all, it reminds us that even men who command the world must answer to history.